started writing poetry in 1975, almost as an accident. My mother was in trouble with the law, and she couldn't get work. So she put me to work selling flowers along the highway, and these colored rubber buckets of flowers. And I have a folding chair, and this is the 1970s, so there are no electronic gadgets to fill the imagination. So I became a reader. And every Thursday, I would go to the library, and I would fill my bag with books. And then I would go out to work all weekends, and I would read these books. And in 1975, that started in 1974, but in 1975, it was Easter Sunday weekend, and I went to get my books on Thursday, and there was a copy of Emily Dickinson's poetry sitting right near where the librarian would have you check out your books. And she said, "Do you know Emily Dickinson?" I said, "I've never heard of this person." And I just put it in the bag. I didn't even think about it. The librarian had made many suggestions for me over the years that were wonderful. She's the one who got me to read Franz Kafka and Sartre and Solzhenitsyn, all these different writers. So, and Albert Camus. But anyway, on Sunday, because I read all my other books, this was the last book in the bag, and I opened it up. And it was like the gates of heaven opening up. I just never looked back. As soon as I read Emily Dickinson's poetry, I was just captured by it and hooked and dragged into the future with her. And I've been writing poetry ever since. I published my first poems when I was a teenager, and it was in the school literary magazine. And they wouldn't allow me to publish under my name, CAConrad. CAConrad is a name that I chose in 1984 because it's genderless. And they refused, so they put in my legal given name. And after that I said I will never allow that again. And since then I've published under the name I chose for myself. So yeah, I started writing poetry in 1975, but when I become a teenager, I run away to Philadelphia. Because where I grew up, everybody worked in factories, and I didn't want to work in the factories. So I went to Philadelphia to be a poet. That was my goal, to be a poet. To read and write poetry. And to just get a little job and live and enjoy my life. So that was in 1984, when I moved to Philadelphia. And I was living my life just as I wanted to. I was very excited about reading and writing poetry every day. But in 2005, skip ahead to 2005, I started making new friends with people who were in a university program for writing. And there was something about the conditions and the relationship between their writing lives and the lives they were living that synced up in a way mine did not. And I couldn't figure out what it was for a while. So I kept thinking about it. And I realized it was because of our backgrounds. My family are all factory workers. Their families are white-collar workers. They're doctors, lawyers, engineers. When my family goes to work in the factory, they become extensions of those machines they work at. And in order to survive those jobs for many hours a day, they have to shut the present off. And they live in the past and the future in their brains. And when I speak with them, I can hear that they are depressed about the past or anxious about the future. There's no present, you see. So when I realized this, I knew that I needed a new relationship with time. And that's where these somatic poetry rituals that I use come from. I started using them in 2005. Their goal was to anchor me in the present. And it worked. The first ones I did, I ate a single color of food for a day for 7 days. And I'm going to wear the color. The first was red. The first day was just red. Red food. And there was a beauty academy down the street from where I live where you learn to cut hair and do nails, salon work. And in the dumpster, there was a long red wig that was poking out of the dumpster. And I took that home and cleaned it up. And I wore this wig, and it was a strange wig. It was like half permed and half straight. So, and I knew that I had been reading this research that as much as, they don't know, it could be as much as 80% of human interaction is nonverbal. That's why I wear a lot of glitter, because it's a conversation. You know, it's part of the nonverbal communication that I'm having. So I thought, oh, well, if I wear this red wig around the city all day, I'm going to get a lot of nonverbal communication, especially because it was so strange. And it did work that way. People would walk clear around me, and I would write the poem. At the end of that first day, I learned two valuable things. One, that it worked. I was present the entire time I was writing. In fact, it might have been the most present I'd ever been in my life writing. The second thing I learned was that I would have never written that poem for any other reason at any other time. Meaning that I knew the rituals were giving me a bigger life. And that they could help me see the world in a newer way. The creative viability of everything around me. And then the book that you at P.O.L have published, While Standing in Line for Death, that was the book where I wanted to see if these rituals could do something else. See if they could push me into some completely different way of being. The opening ritual to the book is called Mount Monadnock Transmission. And I did a ritual to overcome depression. I had a boyfriend who was, well, we lost half of everybody we knew and loved to AIDS. And eventually he was exhausted. And he went to this community and the state of Tennessee to work in the gardens. And we don't know who did this to him, but I assume it was more than one man. They gagged him, tortured him, they bound him, they tied his wrists and hands behind him, they raped him, and then they covered him in gasoline and burned him alive. And it was just, you know, when you're very young and you lose half of everybody you know to a disease, it's overwhelming. But we thought the worst days of our lives were behind us, and then that happened. And he's dead, brutally murdered, and tortured, and dead and gone, and I was just there left behind. So this opening ritual, which I finally managed to do, and it worked, was I used a crystal he gave me the last time I saw him alive, and I put it under my hair wrap, pointing down, and I would swallow a smaller round crystal that would go through my body. It was the worker crystal, the one I swallowed. So it was extracting his information that was in, he kept that crystal in his pocket for over a year and a half. So it was absorbing his personality, his days, his everything. So the job with the worker crystal that I was consuming was to extract his information out of his crystal and put it into my bones, blood, and tissue. And it worked like that within less than a week. I worked on this ritual for almost a month, 27 days, which is, 27 days is the amount of time that it takes for the moon. That's the cycle of the moon. And, which is a full month, really. If we were to have a proper calendar, it would be a moon calendar, and there would be 13 months a year, 27 days a month. That's how I look at it. So I was honoring the natural cycles, because this man I loved named himself Earth. So I wanted to honor his namesake through the moon, which travel around and pulled our oceans and our bodies are mostly water, so we're being pulled by it. Within a week it worked, and I was feeling better. So I'm going to read 3 poems from that section, and they have shapes, the poems, and there is a whole story about why they have shapes. A spider's web is made of digested fly brains, wings, hairs, legs, tears, pheromones, attracting more flies, dissolving us into the endeavor of love. Hold me to your song, it is delicious. Hear you one more time in middle of night, tooth it open. Love all unloved parts without pause. Dear ghost, flickering with flames that no longer hurt, deflated lungs expanding, you say they can only burn a faggot once. When you died the way you died, it was contaminating. A new danger of being lost and insecure. The reality can never be avoided forever. At the same moment, who is afraid of whom? The killers or my beloved? Or guilt of my continued song? Desire is not what we achieve. It's a knife often carving the wrong way or racking the alchemy of a mood. I should never trade youth for poetry's resonance of aging. But I can put every poem I ever wrote in a pile and burn them if you would appear on the other side. I'm going to read one more. This is the poem that I wrote when I knew that this worked. This is the poem I wrote when I knew that the ritual worked and I was feeling better. The spirit of your flowers is my favorite shelter. We were in love is the main thing. Faintest green light and tree pulls me forward. Whenever life is beautiful makes me think of you. Carry color of the forest to be with you. To belong to this world with you. To have what we have. And that is it. Yes, the present is between the past and future, but is too radical to be called the middle. So, the poems, this is the English version of the book that P.O.L published. The poems all have shapes. And the reason they have shapes is that when I started writing poetry in 1975, so from 1975 to 2005, my poems were almost entirely on the left margin. But when I began writing with these rituals, I would feel nauseous, like I was going to throw up. But when I would push the poems off the left margin into the middle of the page, I would suddenly start feeling better and better and better. So these spirits that I work with, I think all poets have spirits whispering in their ears, telling us about the world that we can write about. These spirits, once I started working with the rituals, were like, no more of this left margin. They were trying to show me the violence of the human line, this straight line we're living with. It's like, and you know, during COVID lockdown, we were just surrounded by our straight lines. The natural world doesn't have those lines. Even a line that you think is straight and natural, it still has a little bit of bump. Trees aren't always straight. So, I just surrendered to it, and I began pushing them off the page, the margin into the middle of the page, and I never know what they're going to look like. It's Christmas each time I write a poem. I decided from the beginning, when publishing the rituals in book form at least, to always include some prose writing that explained the ritual, what I did to write the poem. And I have to be honest, prose is not my favorite way to write, so I always save that to the last. I'm nothing against prose, nothing against novelists or novels. It's just a very different space it occupies in our imagination. For instance, prose, by and large, wants to connect things along the way for us. The job of prose, the prose writer, is to send us on a journey. And it's all connected already. But poets, what we do is we correspond ideas and for the reader to put together, or the listener from reading them. So it's up to, so when you're a reader of poetry, you're required to bring your creativity, to bring your imagination, to co-create with the poet. Poetry, reading poetry requires work. And when I meet somebody who says they hate reading poetry, I just quietly to myself think, well, maybe they're a lazy reader, because you have a lot of work to do. Maybe they want to read a novel and be swept away. That's not the job of poetry. So, oh, but I'm glad that I decided to do this, to include the rituals, because they were acts of poetry in themselves. The managing of working with soil or rocks or oceans or anything that my body is invested in. There's one that I could share with you. Would you like me to read another one? So in this case, I'll share the ritual and it's in the book that you published. So I'm going to read the prose, the ritual for this one, and then the resulting poem. So I was born in Topeka, Kansas, and this takes place, so I traveled to where I was born. The ritual is called My Faggot Kansas Blood Confessions to the Earth, and is dedicated to my friend, the writer Elsa Boyer, who's an amazing writer who also was born in Topeka, Kansas. In a Kansas field, I spent several hours burying my feet in the soil while listening to the insects, birds, and cars on the highway beyond the trees. I was born January 1st, 1966, at the 838th Tactical Hospital, Forbes Air Force Base in Topeka, Kansas. My mother said the doctor held me by my ankles and announced, "Another fine soldier for Jesus." And I say, "Fuck you" to those first words said to me. My mother ate food grown on this land when I was inside her. We drank from the same aquifer. The sky was as big as it is today. I took notes for the poem. I dug a hole and deposited shit, piss, vomit, blood, phlegm, hair, skin, fingernails, semen, and tears, and in that order. I apologized for being alive. I apologized for having no answers on how to stop the hyper-militarized racist police on the streets of America while the racist U.S. military is on the streets of Arab nations. I apologized for paying taxes that purchased the bullets, bombs, and drones. I apologized for not convincing my queer sisters and brothers that repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell was only putting a sympathetic face on a multi-trillion-dollar military-industrial complex. I apologized for not finding a way to protect Chelsea Manning. I apologized for many things for a long while, then covered the hole, holding my offerings, and took more notes for my poem. And this is what the poem looks like. It's called My Faggot Blood on His Fist. The first time someone sent Homer through the internet, ... We are all falling in love while standing in line for death. Fuck this way we slowly adjust to suffering. An ant finding her way home in the downpour. Lovers are weapons subjugating your heart if you smell them years after they die. If you feel destroyed, let us talk. Do not turn it off yet. We dreamed our obliteration for centuries. Then Hollywood said, this is what it will look like. Or maybe this. Or maybe this. You think it's everyone's job to make you feel good, which is why we all hate you. The disgraced hairdresser pours another shot. We will figure it out, my friend. The ocean is never far when you feel your pulse. You know, I've heard so many poets over the years say that they don't like overt political messages in their poetry, but I'm a citizen of the United States of America. The United States of America is brutal. 45,000 U.S. citizens were shot and killed last year. 45,000 people shot and killed. That's how many people are shooting one another in the United States. You know, we sell weapons to other countries for their wars, but we're having a war at home. When you see that 45,000 people were shot and killed in a country, wouldn't you assume that it's in the middle of a civil war? I believe the United States is in an undeclared civil war, and has been for years. And it's ongoing, and it doesn't seem to end. People are going into schools and shooting children. They're going into grocery stores and shooting children. There was a grocery store in Boulder, Colorado, where I go to teach every summer, where somebody just last year went in and just started shooting everybody. I forget how many, it was like a dozen people were shot and killed. And when the cameras were going through the grocery store and I saw blood everywhere, I knew those aisles of that grocery store. I knew where I would buy the food that I would buy. And it was just horrifying to see a place where people go to buy things to nourish themselves are being murdered and trying to hide so they don't get shot. I don't really understand what we're supposed to do at this point to change this. I'm not saying I have the solutions, but I do know that there are too many guns. My family has a lot of guns. My mother died earlier this year. There were 32 guns in the house. Shotguns, pistols, you name it. Rifles that I had when I was a child, because I was a hunter as a child. But, I don't know. I don't know how you can be in the United States and be a poet and not talk about it. It's brutal. The violence is remarkable. And Hollywood movies, I mean, has there ever been a more potent, more propaganda machine for violence, pro-violence propaganda machine than Hollywood? The number of people that get blown up and sliced and shot and killed and crushed, you name it, in a Hollywood movie, it's just remarkable. I mean, if we were to get all the Hollywood movies and start watching all of them to count how many people were dead, I don't think there'd be enough time in our lives to count it all. Just know that it's too much. And that it makes it all look fun or something. I don't understand. But I do know this. I do know that it is influencing people in the country where I live. And a lot of people are dying. And it makes it easier to then go to war with other nations. And to sell weapons of war. And we've been killing people in the Middle East for 20 years. We're still there doing it. I don't know. I don't know how it's going to end, you know. I don't know how this violence ends. And it's just heartbreaking. So, it's very acceptable now for people to be trans and changing their gender. But when I first did it in 1984, to have this name that was without gender, CAConrad, it was very unpopular, to say the least. And not just unpopular with heterosexual world, but regular gay and lesbian people didn't want to hear about it. The trans community was fun, because the trans community was always the better part of the community, in my opinion. You know, the trans community in the United States is what gave us Stonewall. The Stonewall riot was fought by transgender people. So the people at the front fighting were always the trans people, the people standing on both sides. So you know, I just, when I made this decision, I said, this is who I am. I don't want this other name I was given. And I decided to just use the initial of my first name and the initial of my second name, and then just go with that. And people refer to me as CA, and that's fine. I like that. I was down in the state of North Carolina. It's in the book, actually. There are 3 rituals in the book that involve political action rituals. I was down in the state of North Carolina in the United States because there was a law, an anti-transgender law. Just a vicious, violent law. In Europe, people don't quite understand in Europe what's going on. The type of Christians that we're dealing with in the United States, it's a form of witch-burning Christianity that you got rid of centuries ago. But it's alive and well and thriving in the United States. It's very strong. These are the people that love Donald Trump, for instance. They're the reason he was our president. Terrifying. Anyway, when I was down there fighting this law on the streets, it was just, I'm older now, you know, I'm in my late 50s. You know, when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, it was different being out on the street protesting. But it just takes a toll on you. So I decided to do a ritual that was kind of fun, where I would blow bubbles. And all these little children would come around, and they would say, oh, you know, the bubbles, we love bubbles. But the parents would walk over because they were a little concerned about me. Fair enough. And when they would come over, I would look up at them because I was sitting down, eye level with the children. I would look up at the parents and say, these are queer bubbles, and they're going to turn your children queer. And the parents, some of them would freak out and run off with their kids, apologizing while they're leaving. But some of them weren't, you know, some of them said, oh, that's fine, you know, whatever my kids will be, will be. Of course, there is no magical bubble to turn anybody anything. But I wanted to have a conversation about the law. And apparently it wasn't enough of a conversation for some of these parents because they were heterosexual, they didn't need to care about it, they didn't think they needed to care about it. But as they were walking away from me, the angry parents, I would say, what are you going to do when if your child is transgender? Are you going to continue living in this state and allow them to be brutalized by the state, the tyranny of the state? So, humor can get the message across as well.